85 years ago, the beaches of Dunkirk in France were the scene of a miracle. From there, between May the 26th and June the 4th, 1940, 338,000 British, Belgian and French soldiers, cut off and surrounded by the German army, were evacuated to safety in an extraordinary operation made possible by hundreds of little ships, the little ships of Dunkirk. This is the story of Operation Dynamo, the part played by the people of Poole and the Dorset Regiment's brave fighting retreat from the advancing German forces. After Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, France and the British Empire declared war on Hitler's Third Reich. The British Expeditionary Force was immediately sent to help defend France, and a key part of this force was 700 men from the 2nd Battalion, the Dorset Regiment.
Well, September 1939, of course, is when the war broke out, and that found the 2nd Battalion of the Dorset Regiment, so that's one of the two regular battalions of professional soldiers. They were based in Aldershot as part of the 2nd Division. And they were commanded by a very remarkable man, Colonel Eric Stevenson, but he was known throughout the regiment as Colonel Steve. He had served in the First World War with great distinction, winning 3 military crosses and being mentioned in dispatches. His is an astonishing story.
After the phony war of October 1939 to April 1940, Germany invaded Belgium, the Netherlands and France in what was known as Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War. 3 Panzer Corps attacked through the Ardennes and drove northwest to the English Channel. By May, German forces had trapped the British Expeditionary Force, the remains of the Belgian forces and 3 French field armies along the northern coast of France.
May the 10th is one of the most important dates in British history. 2 things happened. The first thing that happened was in England, and that was the defeat of the Chamberlain government. Chamberlain lost a vote of confidence, or came very near losing a vote of confidence, and therefore resigned in the House of Commons. And that saw the appointment of Winston Churchill as Prime Minister and the beginning of a businesslike and serious attitude to fighting the war. So that was the turning point there. But it was also a turning point in Europe, because in September 1939, the British Expeditionary Force under Lord Gort had gone over to France. Belgium remained neutral, and they were not allowed to move onto neutral Belgian territory. So they had to remain in France on the Belgian border, wait for something to happen, and then be ready to move up into Belgium in order to meet any invading army. And that is exactly what happened. On May the 10th, the Germans burst into Belgium and through the Ardennes into France further south, and the war really began in earnest. So the British army that we dispatched to France in September 1939 was ill-equipped, ill-trained, badly commanded, and without a proper plan, and without proper agreement with their allies either. So it was a recipe for disaster. However bravely they fought, they'd never have won. The Dorsets had to fight their way back. For them, it was a fighting retreat. The Bren gun carrier platoon played a magnificent role in fighting the rearguard action to allow the rest of the battalion to withdraw.
Across the Channel, preparations were underway, and the responsibility for the evacuation of France fell on the shoulders of Admiral Bertram Ramsay.
So Admiral Ramsay had had a very distinguished career in the Royal Navy. He joined as a young man, as a young midshipman, and he served in very many different types of ship, right up until he left the service as an admiral in 1938. He was then personally recalled back into service by Sir Winston Churchill himself, and he was appointed as the Commander-in-Chief Dover, and he then had the role of defending the English Channel from enemy destroyers, submarines and mine layers. After Christmas of 1939 into early 1940, it was realised that the war really wasn't going the Allies' way. The advance of the Nazi German forces were coming and sweeping across that part of Europe, particularly through the lowlands, Holland and Belgium, and it was determined that they needed to get the British Expeditionary Force back from France. So it was then that Churchill said to Ramsay, I need to be able to get these back, we need to evacuate France, and that was the start really of the evacuation.
He was ordered to assemble as many vessels as he could muster, and the beaches of Dunkirk were chosen to act as an embarkation point to withdraw as many troops as possible. He had to identify and make 3 safe routes into Dunkirk through swept channels. The expectation was that the rescue of between 36 and 40,000 men would be deemed as a success. In actual fact, an astonishing 338,226 men were eventually rescued. On May the 26th, the then senior naval commander in Poole, Commander Cosmo B. Hastings, ordered all owners of small crafts and yachts to register with him.
He was a commander, an old school commander. He'd served with distinction during the First World War, and he lived locally in Swanage. So he knew the waters well, he knew the harbour well, and he was appointed as the naval officer in charge. And he set up the Naval Base headquarters here, where we are now at the Royal Motor Yacht Club, and its first clubhouse was a yacht called Florinda. And he set up his headquarters on there with the assistance of a Lieutenant Commander H. Vandy. Now these two had served together on HMS Ramillies during the First World War at the Battle of Jutland, believe it or not. And Lieutenant Commander Vandy lived in Poole, in Brampton Road, and his house was actually called Ramillies. He was also assisted by a retired naval captain called J.R.C. Cavendish, and he was nominated as the Sea Transport Officer. On the 26th of May, around that time, then Commander Hastings ordered all that had registered with him to fuel up the vessels and then to leave for a south coast port. They didn't know exactly where they were going until they actually got to sea. And bearing in mind that these vessels were relatively small, all of them underneath 100 feet, and all of them had to have a relatively shallow draft, certainly less than 3'6". So these vessels were really only used to going at short distances. And amongst them were all the fishing vessels, the tourist boats that had been used for ferrying tourists around the harbour, and private yachts that had gone from Sultan's Quay and varying different yacht clubs in and around the harbour. So they assembled those and then off they went. Also vessels from the Swanage Motor Company, just to the northwest of the harbour, they were building vessels called gondolas. So 3 of those were offered and went, and also the Skylarks. These were again open boats, 40 foot, but just purely open boats with just manned tillers, no coverings whatsoever.
One of these ships was the Thomas Kirk Wright, the first of several RNLI vessels to go to Dunkirk.
So the Thomas Kirk Wright is a surf-class lifeboat that was built in 1938 in Cowes at Groves and Guttridge on the Isle of Wight. It was built specially for the conditions in Poole, so it has a very flat bottom because it gets very shallow outside, made of Honduran mahogany on the outside and all English oak inside. But what makes it really special is that it was built with an internal propeller, an impeller, so essentially we built one of the early water jet boats here in Poole. So the Thomas Kirk Wright had been here almost a year when it was needed to go to Dunkirk. It was requisitioned by the Royal Navy, who took it from here to Ramsgate and over to Dunkirk as part of a 19 lifeboat flotilla. Because we'd built this boat specially for Poole, It was particularly useful because it was able to get right up to the beach, and in fact it was the first lifeboat to reach the beach in Dunkirk. We know it made 3 trips from Dunkirk back. We know it saved 97 people's lives. On one of the trips it came back damaged on one engine and with a hole in it, but it got repaired and then went back out to save more lives. Once it returned to Poole, it then was repaired and it saved 24 more lives, going out another 65 times between 1939 and 1962.
Then on May the 28th, a flotilla of vessels was assembled, which included fishing boats, pleasure craft, motor yachts, ferries, the Poole lifeboat, and 18 Dutch scoots that had just unloaded refugees onto Brownsea Island. They were ordered to fuel up and deploy to Dover.
My dad was one of the Davis brothers. The fishing community of Poole was a large one. There were lots and lots of families. This was what it was all about. It was all about the fishing. My family, the Davis family, were really a small part of what actually happened in Poole. They were told, well, we want your boats, so can you take them to Dover, and thank you very much. And if they survive, we'll let you have them back, which I think is an incredible trust that people had. And can you imagine that we would allow the government to do such a thing now? I don't know. Maybe we would. My father, he was all ready to take one of the boats. There were 2. There was the Island Queen and there was the Felicity. And he was all ready to take one of them to Dover. But he was stopped outside the harbour and said, no, you're not taking that boat to Dover. You're more used to us all in the harbour. So he wasn't allowed to take the boat to Dover. From there, the Island Queen had, I don't know, she got blown up somehow. She had an accident. I don't know what happened. Nobody can tell me what happened, but she never got to Dunkirk. The Felicity did, and she very proudly bore a plaque on the back of her stern which said that she was one of the little ships that went to Dunkirk.
So Sandy Wills is one of the Wills family. There were many families that were involved in the fishing industry at the time. The Cartridges, the Hayeses and the Wills family in particular. Sandy was quite a renowned character. He kind of took charge of the fishing fleet really, and they respected him for his seamanship and his professionalism. The Navy had told him to go off St Catherine's Point, and go out sort of 14, 15 miles. Well, their vessels weren't really made to go like that. So he said, no, I'm going to go, we're going to stay inland and we'll follow our own path down there, which is what he did do. And successfully got everybody down there safely. And the fishermen then were given their rail fare and they came back home without their boats. And that was, when you think about it, it wasn't just their time, but it was their livelihood that they were giving up. So around the 13th, 14th of May, a high number of refugees arrived in vessels from Holland, mostly from Amsterdam, and they unloaded the refugees onto Brownsea Island.
Hitler overran the Netherlands on May the 10th, 1940. Those with the wherewithal escaped in small boats. The Dutch came first. 600 to 700 came on the first boat and eventually landed on Brownsea on the 14th of May. So once they were there, they were contained. Their boats were requisitioned. They had no longer had a way to escape, although apparently 2 men did try to swim to escape. They didn't feel safe because they had seen what the Germans had done to their homeland. Some of them had been shot at and bombed on the way over. They didn't feel that Britain was safe because they felt that Hitler would invade. Some of them had relatives in the United States of America And so that's where they wanted to end up, not in Britain. The whole total of refugees was said to be 3,000 over the space of 6 weeks. The authorities set up big tents on Church Field. The idea was they would only be there 2 days to be vetted and then sent somewhere else in Britain. So we have no official records. We don't know how long they actually stayed, but the whole camp lasted for 6 weeks. It's very important because it shows that even a small island that is well known now for its wildlife and its red squirrels and the birthplace of scouting and guiding played such an important part to keep people safe during World War II.
Between the 13th, 14th of May and the end of May, over 108 foreign vessels of Belgian and Dutch nationality arrived in Poole Harbour, carrying people. And they were boats of all kinds of different sizes, some as small as 3 and 4 tons, all the way up to the Dutch scoots, which were in excess of 100 tons. So consequently, there was a high number of vessels arriving at around about the time that the signal came in for vessels to register. That's how all of the Dutch scoots were commandeered. If we looked out of this window then in the 26th of May 1940, you would have seen all of the vessels assembling out and them all going off. And bearing in mind there was no radios then, no radio contact, no radars, no high-tech equipment at all. It was all done by dead reckoning. There would have been a lot of trepidation because they didn't know what was in the water between here and Dover, but there was an incentive for them to get there. Now, at the time of the British Expeditionary Force, part of it was the Dorset Regiment. They were involved in this, and particularly the 2nd Battalion of the Dorset Regiment. And so consequently, there were probably a lot of them that knew people that were in the regiment that were over there fighting at the time. So there would have been certainly a feeling of, we've got to get our boys home. I think, in all honesty, when people talk about the spirit of Dunkirk, this is where it was fostered. The people of Poole pulling together. And it certainly was something that they should be proud of, immensely proud of, as part of Poole's heritage.
One of the Poole little ships is still working today.
So the ferry nymph now is operating on the River Stour in Kent, understanding there's another River Stour here at Poole. She operates from a place called Pluck's Gutter by a public house called the Dog and Duck. Initially, people were more interested in the wildlife, but with this major anniversary coming up and major publicity as to the 85th anniversary of Operation Dynamo, we've now got groups and associations and such like very much interested in the history of the ferry nymph being involved with Operation Dynamo. I regard myself as a custodian for posterity. I don't actually own the ferry nymph. As far as I'm concerned, she belongs to the nation. I'm a custodian of a historic ship that helped save this nation. The sense of history is unbelievable. And we sometimes, I'm going to get emotional if I'm not careful. Sometimes when we travel through Sandwich and there are veterans on Sandwich Quay, as we pass through the toll bridge, I normally give them a blast. Quite regularly we get saluted.
On the 27th of May, so that's 2 days after they were first ordered to guard this position and to hold it, Colonel Steve received permission to withdraw when he thought the time was right. Not surprisingly, he did think the time was right, and he ordered his companies forward on the Bassée Canal to retreat from there back into Festubert to assemble, and then they would withdraw. Now that meant that 2 of the companies, B Company and D Company, commanded by Sam Symes, B Company, D Company commanded by Bob Goff, were in a very difficult position. They had to do one of the most difficult manoeuvres any fighting unit can be asked to perform, which is to withdraw while in contact with the enemy. But they did it. When they were ordered to form this rearguard and fight this rearguard action, they weren't expected to come back. They were expected to die or surrender. And they managed to pull out after quite a substantial battle fought by Bob Goff in an orchard there, which scared the Germans off for a bit and enabled them to pull out. And at this point, Colonel Steve became a hero. It's as simple as that. He decided he was going to bring his battalion out personally, and personally he did it. Compass in hand, with his second in command, Tom Malloy, beside him with a map, he led his 245 survivors out. That meant taking them across fields, across fences, across canals, rivers. Some of them couldn't swim, so the non-swimmers had to be helped by those who could swim. And he brought them all back a long way. But there were two incidents in the course of that 5-mile retreat back that are really important to understand. The Germans had got behind them. While they'd been holding that position, the Germans had got across the canal and the line of advance had crossed behind the Dorsets. So that meant any retreat meant crossing the German line of advance. So they were in enemy territory. As they walked along, as they retreated, they came across a lager, a German encampment where they were camping for the night, and they were challenged by a German sentry. Now, leading the whole column was Colonel Steve, with a rifleman beside him with a fixed bayonet. And Colonel Steve said to this chap, "Bayonet the sentry." Well, of course, if you ask a nice man to bayonet somebody else, he hesitates. And you can't afford to hesitate in these circumstances. So Colonel Steve acted, and what he did was pull out his pistol, and this is his very pistol. It's an Enfield .38, and he shot the German sentry. And the curious thing was that although there was an enormous loud bang in the middle of the night, none of the Germans reacted to it in any way, and the column were able to move on. The German line of advance had crossed across the Dorsets, so they had to cross that line of advance in order to get back to the coast. And at one point, they reached a main road, and the main road was full of German traffic. There was an enormous German column that was passing left to right. And so for 45 minutes while this column went past, which is a measure of how large it was, the 245 Dorsets and 40 men from other regiments who Colonel Steve had collected as he'd gone along, crouched in a ditch by the side of the road in the dark, watching these Germans going past. Then finally, when they'd gone, they all got up and they crossed the road. They arrived back at Dunkirk on the 28th or 29th of May, and even then, Colonel Steve didn't release his grip. As they got back into Dunkirk itself, and they had to walk out along the pier at Dunkirk, which had been holed by German dive bombing, they had to clamber across that, and some fool of a staff officer shouted at the Dorsets that they needed to double, to run as they went across this. Colonel Steve turned on him and told him he was a complete idiot, and how could you possibly run across a broken pier like that? So he told his men to walk, and he led them to the end of the pier, where they found themselves boarding a Thames dredger that had come across the channel in order to bring out British troops. And they were brought home. They landed at Margate early in the morning on the 31st of May. And it's Colonel Steve who brought them home. He set a standard of leadership that other Dorset colonels throughout the Second World War would struggle to match.
The beaches themselves would have been an absolute hive of activity. Where they'd been bombing, there would have been a lot of smoke, A lot of the vehicles that had been hit would have been on fire. There would have been a smell of death around, there's no doubt about it, because the strafing and that was going on at the time. The beaches were real wide open expanses of sand. So to come out of the dunes, which were really, I suppose, relatively safe in as much that there was a little bit of shelter, to actually go onto the wide beaches and then see all of those little vessels, including our little Thomas Kirk Wright, chugging in to come and collect them. It must have been a feeling of elation that somebody actually cared, that somebody actually wanted to get them home. And this was their way of getting there. When you come to look at it, there were so many acts of bravery, some which was probably never even gone on record. One local man from here called Jesse Elton. Jesse went through the First World War. He was in the Royal Naval Reserve. He got called up. He was put on the motor yacht Bystander. Bystander was a yacht, a brand new yacht being built for the chairman of the Daily Mirror. He never actually took receipt of it because he loaned it straight away to the Navy and the Navy manned it. Its first trip was to go across to Dunkirk. Jesse was an able seaman cook, so he had the facilities there to be able to cook and look after 8 people. So when the Bystander went into Dunkirk harbour and it started to pick up survivors, there was another vessel in front of it called the King Ori. The King Ori got hit by a direct hit, and all the soldiers that it had on board went overboard into the water. Bearing in mind they were tired, they were hungry, they probably had greatcoats on, so their survival rate in the water was going to be pretty minimal. Jesse put a rope around his waist, dived into the water, and he rescued 25 people. All in all, 95 ended up back on the Bystander from the King Ori. And then Jesse got back on board, and then he cooked them a hot meal and got them all a hot drink. And that, I think, sums up, again, the Dunkirk spirit. It wasn't about me, it was about what I could do for other people and to save them. And I think that would be the feeling that these people would have had going across into an action situation in just an open boat.
The Dorsets came out of it with a very strong reputation, and largely that was thanks to Colonel Steve's leadership, but also the courage of the individual soldiers. Dunkirk was a wake-up call for the British Army and for the politicians. But it's worth remembering that without Dunkirk, if Lord Gort hadn't been able to retrieve the British Army from France, invasion would have been inevitable. Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain were both defensive actions, essentially, and Dunkirk was a defeat. Let's not pretend that it wasn't, it was a defeat. But those two things made possible the continuation of the war, which meant that others like Montgomery and Alexander and Slim could win it. So Gort may not have been a particularly remarkable commanding officer as a general. He was a very brave man, but when confronted with the major decision of his life, which was whether to try to prop up the French army longer or whether to withdraw the British army and evacuate them from Dunkirk, he made the right decision, and thank God he did.
I would for sure call this boat a hero of Dunkirk. We call it a war hero, but we'd call it just a hero because when it came back from Dunkirk, it continued to save lives in Poole. Another 24 lives were saved here. So all our boats we consider to be heroes, but for sure this was definitely a hero at Dunkirk.
I'm very proud of the fact that my family and also other families in Poole all played their part in helping with Dunkirk, because that was a miracle. Can you imagine all those little boats turning up and hauling soldiers on board and bringing them back It was incredible. It really was incredible. And I think that was the point in the 1940s, that everybody was so enthusiastic and wanted to do their bit and wanted to help the country and knew what they had to do. And so they did it. And Poole's part in it was maybe only a little tiny bit, but it was something, and something to be proud of.